Quentin, I admit I have a predisposition slightly to theism, and many of the questions I ask people have an affirmative position towards theism, using some of their arguments. This time I want to do the reverse. I want to give you your best shot at making arguments for atheism or agnosticism. What is the best you've got?
Well, atheism, I believe, is true, but there's too many arguments for it for me to explain them all. So I'm going to try and start with the more unusual ones. They're less stated. One argument is that God cannot cause the universe because the law of conservation of science, one of the basic laws of science, says that each state of the universe is caused by an earlier state. And then you can go back to other basic laws, like Newton Galileo said that something continues in motion or continues at rest unless something interferes with it, which implies that they continue to exist without a cause unless something interferes with it. And only Aristotelian science, which said there has to be a cause of motion, is consistent with the theistic conception. And so theism is really based on Aristotelian science. It's not consistent with, even with Newtonian science, let alone contemporary science.
A current theistic view, though, would say that your total system that has its internal consistent causation, the whole system is a fact of existence that needs to have an explanation, and that explanation is a theistic one.
I think this internal system, it does include the ultimate explanation, and one that is even more explanatory than theism, because theism ends up with a free, spontaneous, uncaused act of will by God, and that is not explained, because it's not explained in terms of a prior desire of God or a cause, and so they don't really end up with an explanation, end up with this brute fact. Whereas science and atheism and naturalism, they do not. They end up with the fact that every state of the universe is caused by a prior state, and so there are no unexplained, uncaused events like God's act of willing.
Okay, what's your second argument?
Second argument would be, well, let's take the argument from evil, which is a standard one. I would put a new twist on it and say that it's actually inconceivable that a good and all-powerful and all-knowing God would create this universe and allow the amount of suffering and disaster and death and famine and disease and the Black Death and the plague in the 14th century. I think it's inconceivable that that could be a means to an equal or greater good. And I say that's inconceivable in the same way a round square is inconceivable.
Well, you know the arguments against that, the free will defense, the soul-building defense, the eschatological future life defense. Theists have a whole panoply, a whole range. It's like a hardware store of answers to the problem of evil.
Well, they have been answered and I think refuted in the literature already. Most of the standard defenses of the theists. And where the theists end up now with the problem of evil is saying that we're in no position to judge whether or not some great evil, probably or probably not, is a means to a greater good. And
which cuts the question off, in essence.
Right, yeah. They say, well, neither of us can answer the question, theist or atheist.
Please go on to something else.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean that's what the theist would
right.
say.
Yeah.
All right. So now, all right. What's the third argument?
Well, a third argument is that theism is inconsistent with science, and in a way that's self-contradictory. Because one argument of theism is that the early universe was fine-tuned in just the right way for life to evolve. Yeah. But so they're presupposing science to get at that conclusion, and yet they're denying science by trying to give an explanation of it in terms of a mind that has no body, which is inconsistent with the neurophysiology and psychology, which says...
So if I get it right, that argument says that theism is cherry picking from science that which they like, fine tuning, and ignoring that which they don't like, which, as you say it, that we've never seen consciousness outside of a physical embodiment.
I put it even stronger, that they are doing something that is a logical contradiction. They're accepting a part of science and then explaining it in terms of something that science has shown does not exist. And they ignore that part. So the theory is internally self-contradictory.
Which is the worst sin for a philosopher.
I think it probably would be, yes.
All right. Any other arguments in your bag of arguments?
A common argument is at the beginning of the universe, it poses a problem for the naturalist or scientist, and therefore God has to explain the Big Bang. But that comes from a lack of understanding of the current scientific theory, which implies that every state nearer the beginning of the Big Bang is caused by an earlier state, and the earlier state is compared to fractions. As you subdivide fractions, you get into smaller pieces of time, and that goes on to an infinite length, and each division into a smaller length is a state of the universe that is caused by an earlier state of the universe that you reach by dividing a fraction again. And another way is by not using fractions, which are called rational numbers, but there is an argument using real numbers, which is actually employed by Big Bang cosmology. And real numbers include all the decimals. Now, their argument is that you take the number 1 and 0, that there's infinite number of instants between 1 and 0, but there's no instant at 0, because that's called the Big Bang singularity, because that's an impossible state. But between any two decimals, there's an infinite number of decimals.
That seems to be some kind of a fallacy, though.
No, that's been standard mathematics for over 100 years. I don't think
it's like Zeno's paradox, getting closer and closer to the wall.
No, this has been accepted part not only of mathematics and science since Cantor's work, but theists accept it too, except for a few who, by rejecting it, they can't use science.
Theists would say that the whole system, however it works, is a beautiful system, and it works so coherently that just couldn't have appeared the way it is.
Well, it didn't just appear. It is caused by earlier parts. It's a series of parts, and each part caused a later part, and each part is caused by earlier part. So it didn't just appear.
But you're looking at each one as a snapshot. Each one is a snapshot, but I'm looking at it as the whole process. If I look at the series of snapshots, i.e. like a movie, a series of still frames that gone quickly, it becomes a movie. So you look at the whole movie, I need to have an explanation. If I look at any snapshot, I can see it was caused by the previous one.
Well, if each single part of the movie exists, that logically implies the movie exists. I mean, it's a contradiction to say that every part of the movie exists in the exact sequence, but the movie doesn't exist.
Well, nobody's arguing the movie doesn't. The movie does exist, but the question is, how do you then explain the existence of the movies? You're saying you can explain everything about the existence of the movie by knowing the sum of its infinite or however many parts. You know everything there is to know about the movie if you know everything there is to know about all of its parts.
By recognizing that each state of the universe is a part of a whole, then you take all the parts of the whole, then that by itself logically implies that the whole exists. I mean, it's quite of a simple argument. Consider if I say the parts of the whole exist, but the whole of which they are parts do not exist.
Well, I'm saying it does exist. You can't explain why the whole exists, even though you can explain why all the parts exist.
Well, it's like it's logically entailed by the parts. I mean, it's a simple matter of logic. If parts of a whole exist, then the parts could not exist as parts of a whole unless that whole exists, or you get a logical contradiction. You're saying the parts exist, but the whole doesn't. And that's a contradiction. So it's just a matter of logic that the whole exists if all the parts do.
Putting together all your arguments, do you come out of this an atheist, absolutely sure that God or some supernatural force does not exist, or have a touch of leavening, as we say, a touch of agnosticism in you? Well, I'm pretty sure of this, but not 100% sure, so maybe I'm a little bit of an agnostic as well.
Well, I think there's so many strong arguments against theism that even just taking a fraction of them, it makes it certain and evident that God does not exist. So I think it's clear and certain that atheism is true, and I don't think there's any possibility that theism could be true.